They say buildings do not have souls, that marble cannot remember, and chandeliers hold no grudges. They say limestone feels nothing when blood spills across it. They are wrong. The Plaza Hotel stands at the corner of Fifth Avenue and Central Park South like a monarch surveying her kingdom. 19 stories of French Renaissance limestone. 118 years of watching empires rise and crumble while she remains exactly where she has always been. Inside these walls, a Hungarian princess kept a menagerie that defied belief. F. Scott Fitzgerald dove fully clothed into the fountain out front while his wife laughed in the moonlight. The Beatles hid from screaming teenagers in a gilded prison on the 12th floor. Truman Capote threw the party of the century, then spent the rest of his life paying for it. The Plaza has witnessed fortunes made and squandered before breakfast. She has hosted honeymoons that ended in murder trials and business meetings that reshaped the global economy. She has sheltered widows who refuse to leave and vagabonds who refuse to pay. She has been sold and resold, renovated and nearly demolished, declared dead and resurrected more times than anyone can count. And through it all, the building simply did not care. This is not a story about real estate. It is not a story about architecture, though the architecture is magnificent. It is not even a story about money, though there is more money in these corridors than most nations will ever see. This is a story about what happens when ordinary humans try to possess something that cannot be possessed. It begins, as all Plaza stories must, with blood. Chapter 1. Where Dreams Were Built in Blood. Summer 1906. 8th floor of an unfinished building. The heat pressed down on New York like a fever. On the construction site at 5th Avenue and 59th Street, men worked in the brutal sun, hauling steel and hammering rivets into what would become the most famous hotel in America. The tension had been building for weeks. Union ironworkers refused to work alongside non-union men. Foremen looked the other way when tools went missing. Threats were muttered in the shadows of half-finished walls. On one stifling afternoon, night watchman Michael Butler climbed to the 8th floor to begin his shift. What happened next would become one of New York's most sensational unsolved crimes. Someone struck him from behind with a metal bolt. Before he could cry out, he was lifted and thrown from the scaffolding, falling 8 stories to his death on the construction debris below. The tabloids called it the mid-air murder. Police arrested several suspects. The trial made headlines for weeks. Witnesses contradicted each other. Evidence vanished. In the end, every accused man walked free. No one was ever convicted, and construction continued without pause. The building that rose from this violence was the vision of Harry S. Black. He was not a hotelier and had never managed a single guest room in his life. Black was a deal-maker who had married into the George A. Fuller construction empire and built U.S. Realty and Improvement Corporation into a force capable of reshaping the Manhattan skyline. The first Plaza Hotel had opened in 1890, an 8-story brick structure considered elegant at the time. But by 1905, it was hopelessly outdated. Black convinced his partners to demolish their own profitable hotel and build something that would make the world take notice. He chose Henry Janeway Hardenberg as his architect. Hardenberg had designed the Dakota on Central Park West and the original Waldorf Astoria. When Black hired him, he was not simply commissioning a building. He was demanding that the Plaza become the greatest hotel ever built. The budget was $12.5 million. The design was French Renaissance, inspired by the chateau of the Loire Valley. The materials were the finest available: Italian marble for the lobbies, French limestone for the facades, rare woods from 4 continents for the paneling. The Palm Court would feature a stained glass ceiling that transformed afternoon tea into something approaching religious experience. While Michael Butler's killers walked free, hundreds of workers continued construction. Steel beams rose into the summer sky. Stone was carved and fitted. The building grew floor by floor, a monument to Gilded Age ambition. On October 1st, 1907, exactly 2 years after groundbreaking, the Plaza Hotel opened its doors. The response was immediate. Reservations had been filled for months. Rooms started at $2.50 per night. but the grandest suites commanded $25 or more. Alfred Gwynne Vanderbilt was among the first prominent guests. Diamond Jim Brady arrived with enough luggage for a small expedition. They came because Harry Black had understood a fundamental truth about the American wealthy. They did not want comfort. They wanted to be seen. The Plaza delivered visibility in abundance. Its location at the southeast corner of Central Park meant that every arrival happened in full view of Fifth Avenue. The grand entrance, with its red carpet and uniformed doormen, transformed checking in into public performance. To stay at the Plaza was to announce to New York that you had arrived. Harry Black watched his creation succeed beyond his projections. The hotel was profitable within its first year, but Black himself would not survive his success. His later years were marked by depression, failed ventures, and a collapsed marriage. In 1930, he took his own life, leaving behind the building that had made his name. 1,650 chandeliers kept burning. The doormen kept opening doors. The guests kept arriving with their steamer trunks and their secrets. The building had learned its first lesson. Owners come and go. The Plaza remains. And within 2 years of opening, she would welcome the most extraordinary resident in her history. A woman who arrived with an entourage, a menagerie of exotic animals, and a lion cub named Goldfleck. Chapter 2. The Princess and Her Lion. She called herself a princess, and no one could prove otherwise. Elizabeth Vilma Lwoff Parlagi arrived at the Plaza Hotel in 1909 with demands that would have sent any reasonable manager running for the exits. She required a 14-room suite. She required accommodations for her 12 servants. She required space for her personal menagerie, which at various times included bears, alligators, falcons, owls, and a collection of dogs that seemed to multiply by the week. The Plaza, perhaps sensing that ordinary guests were not going to make this hotel legendary, said yes to all of it. The princess had been born in Hungary in the early 1860s, though she was not born a princess. That title came later, through a brief marriage to a Russian prince named Lwoff, a union that provided her with aristocratic credentials and little else. The marriage ended quickly. The title remained forever. What she possessed from birth was talent. Lwoff Parlagi had trained as a portrait painter in the European academies, and by her 30s she had established herself as one of the most sought-after artists on the continent. Her portrait of her own mother brought her early fame. Commissions followed from the highest circles of European society. She painted Kaiser Wilhelm II of Germany. She won a gold medal at the Chicago World's Fair in 1893. By the time she crossed the Atlantic, her reputation preceded her like a herald announcing royalty. In New York, she continued painting the powerful and the famous. Andrew Carnegie sat for her. So did Nikola Tesla, whose fascination with electricity and innovation matched her own artistic intensity. Her subjects paid handsomely, and she spent even more handsomely maintaining her suite at the Plaza in a style that blurred the line between luxury and madness. The menagerie was her most visible eccentricity, but hardly her only one. She dressed exclusively in flowing gowns that belonged to an earlier century. She received visitors while reclining on divans surrounded by her animals. She demanded that the Plaza staff address her with full aristocratic protocol, and the staff, trained to accommodate the impossible, obliged without complaint. Among her admirers was General Daniel Sickles, one of the most colorful figures of the Civil War era. Sickles had lost his leg at Gettysburg and donated it to the Army Medical Museum, where he visited it regularly for the rest of his life. He had killed his wife's lover in broad daylight and been acquitted on the first successful temporary insanity defense in American history. By the time he met the princess, he was in his 90s, still sharp-tongued and utterly devoted to her. Legend has it that Sickles helped her acquire the lion. The princess had attended a performance of the Ringling Brothers Circus and fallen instantly in love with a lion cub in one of the acts. She had to have it. The circus, perhaps bewildered by the request from a Hungarian princess, agreed to sell. The cub's name was Goldfleck, and he moved into the Plaza Hotel. Where exactly does one keep a lion in a luxury hotel? The princess solved this problem by installing Goldfleck in her bathtub. where he spent most of his days lounging in what must have been considerable confusion about his circumstances. When the weather was pleasant, she walked him through Central Park on a leash, a sight that New Yorkers accepted with the weary tolerance they reserve for the exceptionally wealthy. The Plaza management permitted all of this. The princess paid her bills, and in the Gilded Age calculus of Manhattan hospitality, money absolved almost any sin. For 5 years she lived in her suite with her servants, her paintings, her animals, and her lion, a walking advertisement for the Plaza's willingness to accommodate the unaccommodatable. Then came the war. When fighting erupted across Europe in 1914, the princess found herself in sudden financial catastrophe. Her income had always been mysterious, flowing from sources she never fully explained. Those sources now dried up completely. Commissions vanished. The wealthy Americans who might have hired her were distracted by global conflict. Her extravagant lifestyle, sustainable only through constant infusions of cash, began to collapse. She fled the Plaza owing $12,000 and left behind a trail of seized paintings. The hotel kept what it could and wrote off the rest. The princess, stripped of her menagerie and most of her possessions, retreated into an increasingly desperate existence. Goldfleck did not survive the upheaval. The lion died, and the princess arranged for him to be buried at the Hartsdale Pet Cemetery in Westchester County, where he remains to this day among the beloved pets of New York's upper classes. The princess herself lasted until 1923, dying in poverty in a cramped Manhattan room surrounded by unsold paintings that no one wanted to buy. The woman who had painted Kaisers and captains of industry, who had walked a lion through Central Park, who had demanded 14 rooms and received them, ended her life forgotten and alone. The Plaza did not mention her in its promotional materials. The suite she had occupied was cleaned, renovated, and rented to the next guest willing to pay. Within a generation, she had become a footnote, a strange story that old-timers told when the conversation turned to the hotel's early days. But her ghost joined the others already gathering in these corridors. The construction worker who fell, the dreamers who built too high, now the princess who reached too far. The Plaza was becoming a museum of American ambition, though no one had planned it that way. The next exhibit was already checking in. A young author and his beautiful wife were about to make the Plaza their personal playground, diving into fountains and scandals with equal enthusiasm. The Jazz Age was coming to Fifth Avenue. Chapter 3. The Fountain Jumpers. He was 23 years old, and the world had just handed him everything he ever wanted. In March 1920, F. Scott Fitzgerald published his first novel. This Side of Paradise sold out its initial print run in 3 days. Critics called him the voice of his generation. Young women across America fell in love with his prose and his photograph. 2 weeks after publication, he married Zelda Sayre, the Montgomery belle who had refused to commit until he proved he could succeed. Now he had proved it. They checked into the Biltmore Hotel to begin their life together, golden and untouchable and absolutely certain that the party would never end. The Biltmore threw them out within a week. The precise offenses have blurred with time, but the pattern was already emerging. Scott and Zelda did not behave like guests. They behaved like characters in a novel that only they could read, spinning through hotel lobbies as if the furniture existed solely for their amusement. They moved to the Commodore. The Commodore threw them out too. The Plaza, somehow, did not. Perhaps the management recognized kindred spirits. Perhaps they calculated that the publicity value of hosting America's most talked-about young couple outweighed the cost of occasional chaos. Whatever the reason, the Plaza became the Fitzgeralds' unofficial headquarters for the next several years. They rented an apartment nearby, but took most of their meals in the hotel's basement grill room, holding court among the afternoon drinkers and the literary hangers-on who were beginning to circle Scott's rising fame. The stories from those years have become impossible to separate from the myths. Supposedly, Scott kept a personal bottle stashed somewhere in the grill room during Prohibition, an arrangement the staff politely ignored. Supposedly, the couple once rode on the roof of a taxi down Fifth Avenue, Zelda's hair streaming behind her like a banner of beautiful recklessness. The stories multiplied because Scott and Zelda understood, perhaps before anyone else of their generation, that celebrity required constant feeding. The fountain incident became the most famous story of all. The Pulitzer Fountain stands in Grand Army Plaza, directly in front of the hotel's main entrance. It features a bronze statue of Pomona, the Roman goddess of abundance, presiding over a basin that was never intended for swimming. According to legend, Scott and Zelda stripped to their underwear and dove in one night, splashing beneath the goddess while hotel guests watched from the windows above. Whether it happened exactly this way or at all, no longer matters. The image became inseparable from who they were. Beautiful, drunk, defiant, treating all of Manhattan like their private playground. Scott wrote the Plaza into his fiction with the care of a man repaying a debt. In The Beautiful and Damned, his doomed couple Anthony and Gloria haunt its corridors. In The Great Gatsby, the hotel hosts the novel's climactic confrontation, the scene where Tom Buchanan finally destroys Jay Gatsby's dream in a sweltering suite while the city roars outside. Fitzgerald understood that the Plaza was not just a setting. It was a symbol, a monument to the wealth his characters craved and the emptiness they found when they finally grasped it. The Jazz Age roared on, and the Fitzgeralds roared with it. Scott's income peaked. The stories kept coming. Zelda began writing her own pieces, painting, dancing with an intensity that worried the people who loved her. They lived in France, on the Riviera, in Paris among the expatriates who were remaking American literature. They drank too much. Everyone drank too much. Then the music stopped. The stock market crashed in October 1929, but the Fitzgeralds had been crashing longer. Scott's drinking had progressed from charming to clinical. Zelda suffered her first serious breakdown in 1930, the beginning of a cycle of hospitalizations that would consume the rest of her life. The couple who had embodied the decade's glamour now embodied its wreckage. Scott spent the 1930s in decline. His books stopped selling. Hollywood hired him to write screenplays, then ignored what he wrote. He took up with a gossip columnist named Sheila Graham and worked on a novel about the movie industry that he would never finish. The Plaza years must have seemed like dispatches from another civilization, one that had collapsed so completely that even the survivors could not quite believe it had existed. He died of a heart attack in December 1940. He was 44 years old. The obituaries treated him as a relic, a cautionary tale about early success and excess. His books were largely out of print. Zelda outlived him by 8 years, confined to Highland Hospital in North Carolina. In March 1948, a fire broke out in the building. She was trapped on a top floor, unable to escape. She was 57. Afternoon tea was still served in the Palm Court. The grill room still poured drinks for whoever could pay. The fountain out front still flowed, indifferent to the ghosts who had once splashed in its waters. If any staff remained who remembered the young couple from the early 20s, they kept their memories to themselves. But something of the Fitzgeralds had seeped into the building's mythology. They had proven that the Plaza was not just a place for the established rich, the Vanderbilts and the Carnegies with their inherited certainties. It could also be a stage for the new American fame, the kind that arrived overnight and burned twice as bright because everyone knew it could not last. A woman named Kay Thompson would understand this perfectly. She was about to move into the Plaza and stay for 7 years, creating a character who would become more famous than any guest who had ever signed the register. Her name was Eloise. She was 6 years old, and she lived on the top floor. Chapter 4. The Woman Who Became Eloise. She had one of the most distinctive voices in Hollywood, and she used it to make other people famous. Kay Thompson arrived at MGM in the 1940s as a vocal arranger and coach, the person studios called when a star needed to sound better than nature had made them. She worked with Frank Sinatra before he became Frank Sinatra. She trained Lena Horne's phrasing. She spent countless hours refining Judy Garland's technique, and in the process became one of Garland's closest friends. Behind every golden voice of the era, there was often Kay Thompson in a rehearsal room, chain-smoking and demanding another take. She wanted more than the background. In 1957, she nearly stole Funny Face from Audrey Hepburn, playing a fashion magazine editor with such crackling energy that audiences wondered why this woman wasn't the star of everything. She had presence, wit, and a personal style so theatrical that ordinary rooms seemed to shrink around her. Hollywood never quite figured out what to do with her. She was too unusual to cast easily, too talented to ignore. So she moved into the Plaza Hotel and refused to leave. The exact timeline has become fuzzy with retellings, but Kay Thompson lived at the Plaza for years during the 1950s, turning a hotel suite into something between a permanent residence and a performance space. She entertained a stream of visitors, decorated with her own peculiar flair, and conducted her life as if the entire hotel existed for her amusement. Management tolerated her eccentricities with the patience they had perfected since the days of the lion-keeping princess. Somewhere in those Plaza years, a character began to emerge. Kay had always possessed a childlike quality beneath her sophistication, a mischievous streak that delighted in chaos and rule-breaking. She began telling stories about a little girl who lived at the Plaza, a 6-year-old terror named Eloise who ran through the hallways, tormented the staff, poured water down the mail chute, and generally treated the Grand Hotel as her personal kingdom. The stories grew more elaborate. Friends demanded she write them down. She resisted at first. Then she met Hilary Knight. Knight was a young illustrator looking for work. Thompson was looking for someone who could see Eloise the way she saw her, not as a sweet children's book character, but as a genuine anarchist in a hairbow. Their collaboration was intense and immediate. Thompson would act out scenes, becoming Eloise completely, while Knight sketched furiously. The drawings captured something that words alone could not. The Plaza itself as a character, its grand spaces reimagined through the eyes of a child who owned none of it but possessed all of it. Eloise appeared in 1955 and flew off bookstore shelves. Parents bought it for children. Adults bought it for themselves. The combination was irresistible. Thompson's anarchic wit, Knight's intricate drawings that rewarded endless examination, and the Plaza as a backdrop that every reader either knew or dreamed of knowing. Eloise was not a story about being rich. It was a story about being free, about treating marble lobbies and uniformed doormen as props in your own private game. The Plaza embraced its fictional resident with calculated enthusiasm. A portrait of Eloise was commissioned and hung in the lobby, where guests could pose beside the little girl who terrorized the halls. Reportedly, a suite was designated the Eloise Room. The hotel had discovered something valuable, a mascot who brought visitors through the doors without requiring an actual room or a tip. Kay Thompson wrote 3 sequels over the following years: Eloise in Paris, Eloise at Christmas Time, Eloise in Moscow. None matched the original's magic, but all sold well. Thompson had created something that would outlast her career, her fame, and eventually her life. She also created a mystery. Eloise lives at the Plaza with a nanny, a turtle, a dog, and a mother who is perpetually absent. The mother sends postcards and charges everything to her account, but she never appears. Readers have speculated for decades about what this absence meant. Was it autobiography? Thompson never married, never had children, but she had been raised partly by nannies herself. Was Eloise the child she might have been? Or the child she might have had? Or simply a fantasy that required no explanation? Thompson refused to answer directly. She became protective of Eloise to the point of ferocity. When the Plaza's ownership changed and new management sought to commercialize the character more aggressively, she resisted. She reportedly turned down requests to use Eloise for promotions that she considered beneath the character's dignity. The little girl who charged everything to her mother's account was not, it turned out, for sale. The portrait of Eloise vanished sometime in the late 1960s. A college had rented the grand ballroom for a dance, and when the evening ended, the painting was gone. Despite investigations, it was never recovered. Somewhere in America, or perhaps beyond, Eloise hangs on a wall, stolen and irreplaceable, the most famous resident of a hotel that has housed Vanderbilts and Beatles. Kay Thompson's final years were quiet. Her fame had faded, her performing days were behind her, and the world had largely forgotten the woman behind the little girl. But she was not alone. Judy Garland had died in 1969, but Judy's daughter Liza had grown up with Kay as a godmother, a mentor, a second mother of sorts. When Thompson could no longer care for herself, Liza took her in. She died in July 1998 at 88 years old in Liza Minnelli's Manhattan apartment. She had outlived most of her contemporaries, outlived the Hollywood that made her, outlived even some of the people she had trained. The obituaries focused on Eloise, as she probably knew they would. The Plaza issued a statement of condolence. The Eloise Room, if it still existed under that name, continued accepting guests. The lobby where the portrait once hung remained elegant and unchanged, though the wall was emptier than it should have been. But in bookstores and libraries and children's bedrooms around the world, a 6-year-old girl kept charging down hallways, pouring water where it didn't belong, and reminding everyone that hotels are not just for sleeping. They are for living, if you have the nerve. And at the Plaza, another kind of nerve was about to be tested. A writer named Truman Capote was planning a party, and he intended to invite everyone who mattered in America. All 540 of them. Chapter 5. The Party of the Century. He had been planning it, in one form or another, for most of his life. Truman Capote understood parties the way generals understand battlefields. Guest lists were strategic documents. Seating arrangements could make or destroy reputations. The right party, thrown at the right moment, could reshape the social landscape of an entire city. He had attended enough of them, charmed his way through enough of them, to know that no one in America had yet thrown the perfect one. In November 1966, he decided to correct that oversight. Capote was 42 years old and at the absolute peak of his powers. In Cold Blood had been published earlier that year, a book that invented a genre and made its author rich beyond anything he had previously imagined. The non-fiction novel about the murder of a Kansas farm family had serialized in The New Yorker to unprecedented attention, then arrived in bookstores to reviews that used words like masterpiece without embarrassment. Capote had spent 6 years reporting and writing it. Now he wanted to celebrate. He chose the Plaza's Grand Ballroom. He chose November 28th, a Monday, because weekends were too obvious. He chose black and white as the only acceptable colors, because constraints forced creativity. He chose masks, to be worn until midnight, because mystery improved even the most famous faces. And he chose Katharine Graham, publisher of the Washington Post, as his guest of honor, because she was powerful, elegant, and recently widowed, a woman who deserved to be seen. Then he began the guest list. Capote composed it in a black and white marble composition notebook, the kind schoolchildren use for homework. The irony pleased him. Inside those ordinary covers, he was writing a social register that would be analyzed for decades. 540 names, each one selected with surgical precision. Some were obvious. His fellow writers, his society friends, the wealthy women he called his swans. Others were calculated provocations, people who would never otherwise occupy the same room. He invited Frank Sinatra and his young wife, Mia Farrow. He invited Andy Warhol, who arrived in a mask that may or may not have been more unsettling than his actual face. He invited Lauren Bacall and Henry Fonda and the Italian princess Luciana Pignatelli, who wore a 60-carat diamond on her forehead because a mask alone seemed insufficient. He invited Kansas farmers who had befriended him during the In Cold Blood research, placing them beside Vanderbilts and Rockefellers. The collision was the point. He also famously did not invite many people. The exclusions generated almost as much coverage as the inclusions. Writers who had given In Cold Blood mixed reviews found themselves mysteriously absent. Social rivals received no envelopes. Capote understood that a party gains power not just from who attends, but from who is forced to read about it the next morning. He wielded the guest list like a weapon, and he enjoyed every cut. The evening of November 28th was cool and drizzly. By 8 o'clock, limousines had created a traffic jam on Fifth Avenue. Inside the Plaza's lobby, nearly 200 photographers jostled for position, more than had shown up for the Beatles 2 years earlier. The masked guests pushed through the flashbulbs toward the grand ballroom, where red tablecloths and gold candelabras waited beneath the chandeliers. Capote greeted arrivals wearing a 39-cent mask he had purchased from F.A.O. Schwartz. Guests who had spent $600 on their disguises pretended not to notice. The party itself unfolded like a carefully orchestrated dream. Peter Duckin's orchestra played. Champagne flowed. 450 bottles of Taitinger by the evening's end. The menu was deliberately simple. Chicken hash, Capote's personal favorite, alongside spaghetti and scrambled eggs. He had spent $16,000 to serve food that could have come from a diner, because the people were the spectacle, not the plates. At midnight, the masks came off. The faces beneath them did not disappoint. Gossip columnists scribbled furiously. Old enemies found themselves dancing with older enemies. Norman Mailer, who had arrived spoiling for intellectual combat, nearly came to blows with McGeorge Bundy, the former National Security Advisor, over the Vietnam War. Friends separated them before the confrontation could become the only story anyone remembered. By 2 a.m, it was over. The guests streamed back to their limousines, their masks tucked into coat pockets as souvenirs. The grand ballroom staff began clearing the tables. The chandeliers, which had witnessed Gilded Age cotillions and Jazz Age scandals, added one more evening to their long memory. The newspapers the next morning confirmed what everyone present already knew. It had been the party of the century. The guest list was printed in full. Analysis pieces examined what it meant, who had risen, who had fallen. Capote had achieved exactly what he intended. He had thrown the last great party of the old world, a gathering so excessive and so glamorous that it could only have happened in the narrow window before such things became unforgivable. What no one knew, including Capote himself, was that the party marked the beginning of his end. He would never finish another major book. The fame that In Cold Blood had brought became a trap, the expectations impossible to meet. He drank more. He worked less. The swans who had adored him began to find his company exhausting. Then, in 1975, he published a chapter from his long-promised novel Answered Prayers in Esquire magazine, and the swans discovered that he had been taking notes on their secrets all along. The betrayal was total. Women who had confided in him for decades found their divorces, their affairs, their cruelties transcribed in barely disguised fiction. Doors that had always opened for Truman Capote slammed shut and never reopened. The guest list for his life grew shorter every year. He died in August 1984 at 59 years old in the Los Angeles home of Joanne Carson, Johnny Carson's ex-wife, one of the few friends who had not abandoned him. The obituaries mentioned the black and white ball prominently, as if that single evening contained everything worth remembering. Perhaps it did. The Plaza's Grand Ballroom continued hosting events. Debutante balls and charity galas and corporate functions filled the calendar year after year. None of them achieved what Capote had achieved, and none of them tried. The era that had made such a party possible was gone, replaced by something more cautious, more calculating, less willing to risk everything on a single night of masks and music. But the room remembered. The chandeliers that had watched Capote greet his 500 guests still burned above every subsequent gathering. The walls that had absorbed the laughter and the gossip and the near brawl over Vietnam kept their secrets, as walls in old hotels learned to do. Somewhere in the archives, presumably, a photographer's contact sheet still exists. The masked faces, the champagne glasses, the collision of worlds that could only have happened in that room, on that night. Thrown by that man who understood parties better than anyone, and paid for the knowledge with everything he had. 6 months before Capote's party, another kind of invasion had stormed the Plaza. 4 young men from Liverpool had checked in, turned the 12th floor into a fortress, and introduced America to a sound it had never heard before. The Beatles had arrived, and the Plaza would never be quite the same. Chapter 6: The British Invasion. They landed in a country that had no idea what was about to happen. On February 7th, 1964, Pan Am Flight 101 from London touched down at John F. Kennedy International Airport. Inside were 4 young men from Liverpool with odd haircuts and matching suits who had been famous in Britain for over a year, but remained virtually unknown in America. Their single, "I Want to Hold Your Hand," had just reached #1 on the Billboard charts. Capitol Records had spent $50,000 on promotion. No one knew if it would be enough. It was more than enough. Between 3,000 and 5,000 teenagers had gathered at the airport, a screaming mass that shocked the police, the press, and the Beatles themselves. The flashbulbs never stopped. The questions came too fast to answer. When someone asked John Lennon how the group had found America, he replied, "Turn left at Greenland." From the airport, a motorcade wound through Queens toward Manhattan. The destination was the Plaza Hotel, where management was already regretting a decision made weeks earlier. The story goes like this. When the Beatles' representatives first called to book rooms, the manager refused. But his 12-year-old daughter learned of the refusal and threw a hysterical fit. The manager relented. Whether entirely true or partly legend, the result was undeniable. The Beatles were coming to the Plaza, and the hotel had no idea what that meant. By the time the limousines arrived, thousands of fans had surrounded the building. 50 police officers struggled to maintain order. Barricades bent under the pressure of teenage bodies. Hotel guests who had paid for quiet elegance found themselves trapped in a siege. The Beatles were installed on the 12th floor in connecting suites that became their luxurious cage. They could not leave without causing riots. They could not approach windows without triggering fresh waves of screaming. Room service became their lifeline. The telephone switchboard collapsed under the volume of calls. George Harrison was the most miserable of the 4. He had arrived with a high fever and strep throat that would keep him bedridden for much of the visit. His sister Louise came to nurse him while the others ventured out for carefully controlled excursions. John, Paul, and Ringo escaped to Central Park on February 8th, accompanied by photographers and security. The images became iconic. 3 Beatles clowning on benches and boulders, breath visible in the winter air, New York's skyline rising behind them. The real conquest came the following night. On February 9th, the Beatles performed on The Ed Sullivan Show before an estimated 73 million Americans, roughly 40% of the country. Crime supposedly dropped during the broadcast. The performance lasted less than 15 minutes. It changed everything. Yet the Beatles themselves, according to hotel staff, were remarkably easy guests. They were polite, tipped generously, and did not trash their rooms. One employee summarized, "Exceptionally well behaved. No noise, no nothing." They left for Washington on February 11th, returning briefly to the Plaza the following day for 2 triumphant concerts at Carnegie Hall. When housekeeping finally entered the 12th floor suites, they discovered one anomaly. Every coat hanger had vanished. The Beatles, it seemed, collected them as souvenirs. The Plaza made clear they were not welcome back. When the Beatles returned to New York for future tours, they stayed at the Warwick Hotel, where management had presumably been warned about the hangers. But the Plaza had gained something valuable. It had become part of the most important week in rock and roll history. The building that had hosted Vanderbilts and Fitzgeralds, princesses and party throwers, had now hosted the 20th century itself. The 12th floor returned to ordinary rhythms, but the hotel had added another chapter to its legend, proof that it could contain any kind of fame, no matter how loud. Next would come Hollywood. Chapter 7. The most filmed building in New York. The camera loved the Plaza from the beginning. Something about those limestone facades and that grand entrance made directors reach for their widest lenses. The building photographed like a movie star, always ready for its close-up, never showing a bad angle, capable of playing sophistication and menace with equal conviction. Alfred Hitchcock understood this better than anyone. In North by Northwest, released in 1959, he used the Plaza's Oak Bar to launch one of cinema's greatest cases of mistaken identity. Cary Grant sits drinking, elegant and unsuspecting, when 2 men approach and address him as someone he is not. Within minutes, he is being escorted out at gunpoint, kidnapped into an adventure that will take him to Mount Rushmore. The scene established what would become the Plaza's signature screen presence. a place where the ordinary surface concealed extraordinary dangers. The 1960s brought romantic comedy. In Barefoot in the Park, Robert Redford and Jane Fonda played newlyweds whose honeymoon suite represented everything young couples dreamed of before real life intervened. Funny Girl featured Barbra Streisand sweeping through its corridors. Midnight Cowboy used its grandeur as counterpoint to the desperation lurking elsewhere in the city. Then came the film that most completely captured what the Plaza meant to a certain kind of dreamer. The Great Gatsby arrived in 1974 with Robert Redford as Jay Gatsby and Mia Farrow as Daisy Buchanan. F. Scott Fitzgerald had set his novel's climactic confrontation at the Plaza, and now audiences could see the suite where Tom Buchanan destroyed Gatsby's illusions on a sweltering summer afternoon. The hotel became inseparable from the story's themes: wealth and emptiness, beauty and corruption, the green light that always recedes no matter how fast you chase it. The films kept coming. Network used its interiors for corporate ruthlessness. Arthur turned the hotel into a playground for a drunken millionaire who refused to grow up. Crocodile Dundee arrived in 1986 with Paul Hogan's Australian bushman encountering a bidet for the first time. The scene played the Plaza for comedy, but it underscored the building's symbolic weight. Even a man who had wrestled crocodiles recognized that the Plaza meant something. The most enduring performance came in 1992, when a 10-year-old boy checked in with a stolen credit card. Home Alone. 2. Lost in New York transformed the Plaza into a character as vivid as any human in the cast. Macaulay Culkin's Kevin McAllister wandered its lobbies, tormented its staff, and slid across its floors with the confidence of someone who belonged there by sheer force of imagination. The film's owner at the time made a brief cameo, but the real star was the building itself. Production crews discovered something unexpected during filming. When they pulled up carpeting for a sliding scene, they found an elaborate floor mosaic hidden for decades. The owner liked the look so much that the carpet was never replaced. The hotel continued accumulating screen credits, Almost Famous in 2000, Bride Wars in 2009, built entirely around two women fighting for the same June wedding date, American Hustle in 2013. Television, from Sex and the City to Gossip Girl, treated the Plaza as shorthand for a certain kind of New York fantasy. What made the building irresistible to filmmakers was precisely what made it irresistible to guests. The Plaza looked like what people imagined when they imagined wealth and glamour and the American dream made tangible. Directors knew they could place any character in that lobby, and audiences would immediately understand the stakes. More than 100 productions have used the Plaza as a location. The building has played itself more often than most actors have played anyone. It has witnessed fictional murders and fictional weddings, fictional heartbreaks and fictional triumphs. And through all of it, the actual hotel kept operating. Real guests walked past camera crews. Real doormen greeted tourists who recognized the entrance from a dozen movies. The line between the Plaza and its image had become impossible to draw. That duality would soon be tested. A new owner was about to arrive, one who understood image and reality better than anyone, and who would remake the Plaza in ways that still provoke argument today. His name was Donald Trump, and he had plans. Chapter 8. The 39 Widows. They called them the 39 Widows, though there were never exactly 39, and not all of them were technically widowed. The name stuck anyway, passed down through generations of bellhops and managers like a piece of hotel folklore. It referred to the wealthy older women who made the Plaza their permanent home, who paid their rent month after month while the world outside changed in ways they preferred not to notice. At the turn of the century, when the Plaza first opened, 90% of its occupants were long-term residents. The words hotel and apartment meant almost the same thing to people with enough money. You chose your rooms, you arranged your furniture, you instructed the staff on your preferences, and you stayed until you had a reason to leave. Many of the widows never found such a reason. During the Great Depression, when transient guests vanished and the hotel bled money, these women kept the Plaza alive. Their monthly rent checks arrived with the reliability of the seasons. Management understood what this meant and treated the widows accordingly. Whatever eccentricities emerged behind those closed doors, whatever demands were made of the increasingly exhausted staff, the checks kept coming. The Plaza adjusted accordingly. Clara Belle Walsh was the first and perhaps the grandest of them all. A Kentucky heiress with broad shoulders and a talent for horses, she claimed to have arrived when the hotel opened in 1907 and remained until her death half a century later. Society writers chronicled her movements as if she were royalty. Her address had become her identity. Walsh was credited, dubiously, with inventing the cocktail party. At one legendary gathering, she required guests to navigate an obstacle course to reach the bar, dressed according to a kindergarten theme, while martinis were served in baby bottles. It was the kind of entertainment that only the very rich can afford to find amusing. In her final years, she ate what she liked and drank only bourbon. At a party thrown for her birthday in 1957, surrounded by snapdragons, she remarked that the flowers were more appropriate at a gangster's funeral. She seemed to be in excellent health. It would be her last grand appearance. But Walsh, for all her prominence, is not the widow most remembered today. That distinction belongs to Fanny Lowenstein, who arrived at the Plaza in 1958 as a young divorcee, and soon met a fellow resident named Leo. Her new husband held a seat on the New York Stock Exchange, which was useful. More useful still was his possession of one of the few rent-controlled apartments in the building. When Leo died 3 years later, Fanny inherited both the apartment and its extraordinary terms. For the next 3 decades, she paid $800 a month for rooms that would have cost more than $1,200 per night. She could not be evicted. The staff treated her with extreme deference, terrified of her tantrums. Each evening, Fanny descended to the Palm Court for dinner. A waiter took her regular order, asparagus soup and Hennessy cognac. The musicians stopped whatever they were playing, and the violinist serenaded her personally. She expected nothing less. One hotel manager would later call her the Eloise from Hell. The comparison was apt. Like the fictional 6-year-old who terrorized these same corridors, Fanny Lowenstein treated the Plaza as her private domain. She complained about everything. She screamed at everyone. She was tiny, elderly, and absolutely fearless. When a new owner arrived in the late 1980s, she demanded a personal meeting. He granted it. She ordered his general manager to leave the room. The owner complied. As her health declined, Lowenstein became convinced that toxic paint was poisoning her apartment. She insisted that her curtains were shrinking, that her Steinway grand piano was developing mold. She called city inspectors repeatedly. She mounted what could only be described as a campaign against the building she had called home for more than 30 years. In 1992, she finally left, moving to the Park Lane Hotel down the street, where she paid full price for the first time in decades. She died there a few weeks later, on April 28th. She was 85 years old. Fanny Lowenstein was the last of the rent-controlled holdouts, the final widow who remembered what the Plaza had been before the renovations and the conversions and the transformation into something more profitable and less personal. When she died, an era ended. The widows had never been particularly lovable. They were demanding, eccentric, and often unpleasant to the staff who served them. One was said to have relieved herself on the Palm Court carpet during a fit of temper. They hoarded their grievances and their diamonds with equal determination. They refused to adapt to a world that had stopped accommodating people like them everywhere except within these walls. And yet they had also saved the Plaza when no one else would. They had paid their rent through depressions and wars, through changes in ownership and changes in fashion. They had treated the hotel as home at a time when you chose your place and stayed there until the end. The corridors where they once shuffled to dinner are quieter now. The suites they occupied have been sold as condominiums or converted into something more modern. The string quartet in the Palm Court has vanished. The era of women who measured their lives by the decades spent at a single address belongs to a New York that no longer exists. But the building remembers them, in its way. The 39 widows kept the Plaza alive when the world forgot it. That debt remains on the ledger, unpaid and unpayable, long after the last of them has gone. Chapter 9. Dark Corridors. The Plaza has always attracted trouble. A building this beautiful, this famous, this expensive becomes a magnet for every kind of scandal, crime, and human weakness. The dark stories pile up like unpaid bar tabs. Consider the first scandal, which arrived before the hotel was even a month old. In November 1907, the British actress Mrs. Patrick Campbell checked into her suite, dressed for dinner, and descended to the Palm Court. She ordered her meal, lit a cigarette, and smoked it. A woman. Smoking. In public. The headwaiter rushed over and demanded she extinguish it immediately. She reportedly shrugged and said she understood this was a free country and had no intention of changing it. The restaurant erected privacy screens around her table while newspapers across the city erupted in debate about the evils of tobacco and the moral decline of modern women. A cigarette. That was the first Plaza scandal. The others would be considerably worse. The 1970s nearly destroyed both the hotel and the city around it. New York was bleeding money, bleeding residents, bleeding hope. A garbage strike in 1975 left a pile of trash next to the Plaza entrance that stood 7 feet tall and 5 feet wide. Guests stepped over rats to reach the front door. The city came within hours of declaring bankruptcy. Central Park, visible from every south-facing window, had become a place where tourists were advised not to walk after dark. Then came the crimes. In 1972, armed men stormed the hotel, took more than a dozen staff members hostage, and raided the safe. They escaped with $265,000 in valuables, including an emerald tiara that was never recovered. The following year, the hotel received letters threatening to blow up the building unless a ransom was paid. The notes were signed by Black September, the Palestinian terrorist organization responsible for the Munich Olympics massacre. Police eventually traced the threats to a house painter who needed money to open a restaurant. A doctor was attacked with a knife when he answered a knock on his suite door. 2 couples were robbed at gunpoint, leaving a charity gala. 2 prostitutes mugged a politician on the sidewalk outside, contributing to Central Park South's unfortunate nickname, the Prostitutes' Promenade. The Plaza had become, like the city itself, a place where anything could happen and usually did. Not all the scandals involved violence. Some were simply strange. A socialite named Susan Rosenstiel claimed she had once seen J. Edgar Hoover, the fearsome director of the FBI, attending parties at the Plaza dressed in women's clothing, complete with heels, makeup, and a wig. The story was published in a biography of Hoover in 1993 and was treated as credible for years before being largely discredited. But the rumor persisted, as Plaza rumors always do. In 1992, Woody Allen held an infamous press conference at the hotel to address his relationship with Soon-Yi Previn, the adopted daughter of his longtime partner Mia Farrow. Photographers and reporters filled the room. Allen spoke carefully about love and timing and private matters made public. The building that had witnessed so many declarations of devotion now witnessed this particular one, and the cameras preserved every awkward moment. 2 decades later, Charlie Sheen was arrested at the Plaza during his very public unraveling. The details were tabloid fodder for weeks. The hotel declined to comment, but perhaps the strangest chapter in the Plaza's ownership history unfolded not in New York but in Delhi, India, 7,000 miles away. In 2012, an Indian conglomerate called the Sahara Group purchased a stake in the Plaza. The company's founder, Subrata Roy, was a flamboyant billionaire who called himself the chief guardian of the world's largest family and lived on a 300-acre estate featuring its own hospital, helipad, and a 26-foot statue of Mother India. His employees greeted each other with a special hand-over-heart Sahara salute. In 2014, Roy was arrested for failing to appear at court hearings related to an alleged $4 billion investment scheme. He was sent to Tihar Jail, the largest prison complex in South Asia, home to more than 12,000 inmates. And there, from a small conference room equipped with video screens and Wi-Fi, he attempted to negotiate the sale of his Plaza Hotel stake to raise the $1.6 billion he needed for bail. For months, The legendary New York hotel was effectively being managed from a prison cell. Roy received visitors, conducted video conferences, and entertained offers from potential buyers, while sleeping on a narrow bed and eating meals from the prison canteen. The building where F. Scott Fitzgerald had once danced in the fountain was now an asset in an Indian securities fraud case. Roy was eventually released on parole in 2016. He died in 2023, his legal troubles never fully resolved. The Plaza, as always, survived the association. This has been the pattern. The building attracts scandal the way Central Park attracts pigeons. Owners come and go, some make fortunes, others lose them. The walls hold every story and reveal nothing. In 1988, Donald Trump purchased the Plaza for $390 million. By 1992, the hotel had accumulated $550 million in debt and filed for bankruptcy protection. Trump surrendered nearly half his ownership stake to his lenders. He was the only owner in the Plaza's history to ever bankrupt the property. He kept his name on the building anyway. The scandals continue to pile up. The corridors grow darker and then lighter again with each renovation. New guests check in without knowing which suite once hosted which disaster. The staff, as always, says nothing. Discretion is part of the job description. But the building knows. It keeps its own records, written in worn carpet and patched plaster and rooms that feel somehow different from the others, though no one can explain exactly why. 118 years of secrets pressed into every wall. Some of them will never be told. Chapter 10. The Building That Doesn't Care. Stand on Fifth Avenue at dusk and watch the Plaza turn gold in the fading light. The limestone catches the sun differently at this hour, warming from white to honey to amber as the day surrenders to evening. Taxis stream past in yellow currents. Tourists pause to take photographs they will never look at again. The horse-drawn carriages line up along Central Park South, waiting for passengers who want to believe, if only for 20 minutes, that they have stepped into another century. The building does not notice any of this. 118 years of human drama have unfolded within these walls. Murders and marriages, fortunes won and squandered. Children have grown old here. Old women have died in rooms where they once danced as girls. The chandeliers have hung above betrayals that would fill libraries, and romances that deserved better endings, and ordinary Tuesday afternoons when nothing happened at all except the steady accumulation of time. The Plaza has outlasted every person who ever walked through its doors. This is what the tourists photographing the facade do not understand. They see the building as a monument to wealth, to glamour, to some imagined golden age when everything was more elegant and people dressed for dinner. But monuments are built to honor the dead. The Plaza is not a monument. It is a machine for generating stories, and it will keep generating them long after everyone currently alive has been forgotten. The princess with her lion is gone. The novelist who jumped into the fountain is gone. The widows who paid their rent through 2 world wars are gone. The party of the century has become a paragraph in other people's memoirs. Even the scandals have faded into footnotes. And still the building stands. New owners will come. They always do. Some will renovate and some will neglect, and some will try to squeeze every last dollar from the address before moving on to the next trophy. The staff will change and change again. The guests will cycle through in an endless parade of honeymoons and business trips and family reunions, each one believing their stay is somehow special, each one leaving behind nothing but a room to be cleaned and prepared for the next arrival. The Plaza does not care about any of them. It remembers everything, but remembering is not the same as mourning. It is simply the nature of buildings, which exist on a different timescale than the creatures who move through them. 100 years is nothing to stone and steel. A human life is a single breath. This is what the Plaza has never tried to hide. It will be here long after we are gone. The chandeliers will blaze. The elevators will rise. The doormen will open doors for people whose names no one will remember. And somewhere, in a suite on an upper floor, someone is checking in right now. They have no idea what happened in that room before they arrived. They do not know whose laughter once filled those rooms, or whose tears, or whose last words. They only know that they are here, for this moment, in this place that has seen everything and forgotten nothing. The plaza endures. That is all it has ever done. That is all it will ever do.